Good evening, everybody. Good morning for the early birds in Europe. I'm very pleased to open this first edition of the Seaweed Around the Clock. And tonight, or this morning, with us on the panel, we have Tearii Alpha. He's the Vice President and the Minister for the Seas from French Polynesia. He's on his way home because tonight it's his wife's birthday. So he's live from the car and he will do the introduction of this first edition. Tearii, the floor is yours.
Yorana, good evening from French Polynesia, from Tahiti. It is my great pleasure and honor to open the first digital edition of Seaweed Around the Clock, which will explore the real potential of seaweed all over the world. My ministry is focused on developing the best sustainable options to innovate and create eco-friendly solutions to produce food and any other valuable compounds from the sea. Seaweed is one among the to accelerate. Indeed, seaweeds could all allow a new social economic way to ensure decent incomes to island farmers and create a value chain which will foster economic opportunities and local development. In Pacific Island countries and territories, and in French Polynesia, seaweeds have been traditionally used as food, disease remedy, and ceremonial objects. Throughout the region, human consumption of seaweeds is widespread. Nowadays, some edible species have been cultivated and for food exports, sea grape and green caviar, and for agricultural fertilization. But main production is for feed. In French Polynesia, several researches programs have been and to explore the diversity of marine algae as a source of biotechnology. Extracts from marine macroalgae from French Polynesia were evaluated for several biological activities, mainly by our University of French Polynesia. Now, a private company is working on wild sargassum and turbinaria floating beds, which could present an interest for agricultural fertilization and their extractable biomolecules. Some Polynesian scientists are already currently working with the fronts of wild padina species, which contain several biomolecules. Some of these molecules are pharmaceuticals purpose, and some others for formulated and for the cosmetic industry. The government aims for several years to develop insular rural seaweed farming projects like shrimps, seaweeds, and fish seaweeds are emerging. These projects could offer interesting socio-economic opportunities for French Polynesia in eco-friendly aquaculture, partially based on seaweed production. I look forward to receiving and share your ideas and collaborative projects to develop the seaweed industry in our country around. And I'm also congratulate Mr. Pierre Erwes for this very good initiative to share our knowledge for this Seaweed Around good conference. And I am now passing the flag to our friends in New Zealand and for the Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tearii, for this nice introduction. And we have a date. We're going to work on a Global Pacific Seaweed Conference or Marine Bioresources Conference. And as soon as we can, we're going to talk about this great initiative. So we let you go. We wish your wife a very nice birthday. Enjoy your evening and talk to you soon. Thank you, Tearii.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
That was a nice introduction, live from the car in Tahiti. So now we are in New Zealand with our three panelists, and I will ask you to introduce you quickly for our audience. So, Brendan, you go first.
Kia ora, Pierre, thank you for that. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko hikaroro te mauka, waikawaiti te awa, ko pukutaraki te marae, ko kai Tahu te iwi. Kia ora, my name is Brendan Flack. I live in the southern part of the South Island of New Zealand. I'm part of the tribe Ngāi Tahu, and today we'll be speaking around our stewardship in our ocean and our customary protected areas. Nō reira, tēnā koutou. Kia ora.
Hayley, what don't you do
hi,
next?
everyone. Oh, hi there. I'm in Auckland, which is on the North Island, and I run a small business called Pacific Harvest. So we supply a range of food-grade seaweeds across lots of different species to the health and organic shop trade and via our website online as well, to nutritionists, naturopaths, chefs. And I'm delighted to be involved with this event. Thank you very much for including us. I personally, I'm quite new to the industry, but I entered it when I bought this business at the end of 2019, but I have a real passion and growing wonder for seaweeds. The more I learn, the more kind of contagious it becomes and the more excited I become about the future. So it's wonderful to be on this panel with everyone today.
Perfect. Before I pass the floor to Nigel, who will introduce himself and give us a brief overview of the seaweed industry in New Zealand, I just want to share the apologies of Claire. She has a loss in her family, and we pray for a loss. And she won't be with us today. And Claire is, one of the directors from the Agri-Sea New Zealand, and she is a good resource also for seaweed. And hopefully we'll catch up with her later. And we think about you and your family, Claire. Thank you. Nigel, you're next.
Thank you, Pierre. So my name is Nigel Bradley. First, I want to acknowledge, Pierre, you've done a huge amount of work in preparing the agenda and contacting everyone around the world, and I really congratulate you. I think it's an amazing achievement.
Thank you.
And also thank you for acknowledging Claire's absence. We equally hope that her and her family are well. So my background is in environmental science and policy, and I've been involved in the seaweed sector for about 3 or 4 years in New Zealand. My company is called Envirostrat, and we develop projects with high environmental and social impact that can also provide a financial return on investment. And so I'll talk a little bit more later about a couple of the projects that we have been leading and adapting from other countries. But we're working in a number of areas in the seaweed sector. So Pierre, shall I move on to just talking briefly about the seaweed sector in New Zealand?
Yes.
Okay. So I won't spend too long because I think we have a lot of questions to discuss, and I'm keen for my other panelists to be able to talk as well. So very quickly, seaweed in New Zealand is a very small sector at the moment, but there is a huge amount of interest, as we see throughout the world, in the potential for seaweed on many different fronts. And we in New Zealand are, much like others, are really excited about the potential, but equally we recognise that we are at the bottom of the world, so we're a long way from markets. We are entering a sector where there has been an awful lot of activity for many years, hundreds of years in the cases of some countries. And so as a country, it's really important that we don't try and compete on the same basis as some of those other countries and participants that have very deep experience and are much closer to the international markets. So that's something I think we'll talk a lot more about. But we have the fourth largest exclusive economic zone in the world. So we have a huge amount of water space, and we have for what is a fairly small country, we have a lot of coastline as well. And so there are very, very good growing conditions. There are hundreds of native species of seaweed here, many of which we don't know a lot about, but increasingly the research community is developing knowledge that we believe can really advance the New Zealand potential seaweed sector. We also have generally clean water, which is a big advantage over some other parts of the world. We have a very good labour market, which is also perhaps an advantage compared to some parts of the world, but equally it makes producing food in the primary, or products in the primary sector, more expensive. So in some ways it's a disadvantage. New Zealand, I think, is perceived globally as a good country to do business with integrity, with transparency. So these are advantages I think we have. We have a very supportive government at the moment, and I think that's incredibly helpful as the sector begins a journey towards being a high value, sustainable sector. We have increasing investment in research, in technology, and as a country and as a people, I think we're very innovative, and that's something I think a lot of the world recognises. The disadvantages for us is, the biggest disadvantage I think, is that there is no supply chain in New Zealand for seaweed. So although we have some companies, and Agrosea, which is the company that Claire, who can't be with us, is co-owner of, they've been around for 25 years doing all sorts of amazing work with Clonia, which is a native brown seaweed, but they are not receiving that Clonia from farms. There are no hatcheries either. And so because we don't have either hatcheries or farming seaweed in New Zealand, we have massive constraints on the ability of that sector to realise its potential. And I know Hayley will talk later about the frustrations that she has as a high value add food business in having to import some of the same species that we happen to have here, but because we don't have a supply chain, that's a real problem for us. Brendan's introduction was really important, because one of the things that's really unique, not entirely unique to New Zealand, but our bicultural context. So we have the Māori people, a number of tribes, many tribes around New Zealand. They've been here for a long time, and we, I think, are more advanced than just about any other country in the way that the government and society has been able to, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but has been able to recognise the bicultural differences and the opportunities to work together. And going back in time, hundreds of years, seaweed has been used by Māori as a food, as fibre, medicine, and materials. So it's not something that we are just discovering now. In fact, Māori have been using this for many hundreds of years. And so we have that very long historic association with seaweed and with the sea more generally. So I think in summary, we have an emerging seaweed sector. We have a huge amount of interest. We have strong support from government, although government needs industry and Māori and stakeholders to help it work out how best government can help. We have a really strong background in innovation. We have very supportive research, funding and support from government. And I think we see ourselves as being on the cusp of what could become a really productive, high-value sector for New Zealand. So I think that's probably enough of an introduction from me.
That's perfect. And we have a good understanding of the potential of New Zealand. So let me start with Brandon. My first question, Brandon, is how New Zealand could play an important role developing a new route for the sustainable seaweed industry. And the question is directly linked to your, I would say, personal position as a leading person, for the connecting with the civil society, and that's an important component in New Zealand. So I'd like to understand, from your point of view, how do you think we can develop this new seaweed industry in New Zealand, and what will be the role of Maori people?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. Yes, well, As Nigel said, the biculturalism in New Zealand is important. We have a treaty partnership with our government, and so although Māori often have to remind the government of that treaty partnership, I think that's a really strong relationship that can be used in the commercialisation of our seaweed industry as it goes forward. And also, as Nigel had said, the use and the mātauranga, or the knowledge around seaweeds and some of their medicinal or other uses is, orally has been passed down through those generations. And I think that perhaps industry and researchers, if they can value that mātauranga, that traditional knowledge, alongside of these perhaps regimes of testing, would actually take some of that knowledge at face value in terms of the rongoa, those medicinal properties that some of our seaweeds have. I think it could position this country strongly in terms of, I guess, just getting ourselves up to speed with the rest of the world, perhaps. I'm not sure if that answers the question, Pierre, but
that will be a good start. We will come back, to more details, information about the potential and the synergies between the industry and the local communities. But it's a good start. And now let me turn to Hayley. You're on the marketing side, product development. So how do you see this new route, for seaweed? You've been in and around about the marketing aspect and the development of products and the brand New Zealand. So how do you see the route for the seaweed industry? Call it in seaweed, sustainable seaweed industry. What is your perspective on this, Hayley?
Thanks, Pierre. So perhaps I should this business is also quite established. It was built by the couple that I bought the business from in 2019, but they established it back in the early 2000s. So although we've been around for a long time and are very sort of established in the nutritional community as the go-to destination for seaweeds. So for us, when we bought the business, there's so many things to use seaweed for. We really had to sort of try and work out where we were going to focus, and decided to remain true to the roots of what Pacific Harvest has been about, and that's really just supplying a range of high quality food grade seaweeds as food, not as medicine. So we're really clear on which part of the market we are kind of offering our products to. And as Nigel alluded to earlier, we are not, unfortunately, we're surrounded by this beautiful ocean full of delicious seaweed, but for a number of reasons, we have some limitations in accessing either the seaweed or being able to access the seaweed at a food grade level because of the comments Nigel again already alluded to around the supply chain being very immature. So this does present some challenges for us, and it is heartbreaking to have to import seaweeds that grow around our shores. The carbon footprint of it is just completely foreign. It just doesn't connect in my mind that we should have to import things that grow here. But it is important that we make sure that we are working with seaweed harvesters who are working ethically, so and sustainably harvesting the food, because I think that's one of the things that's really struck me is the end consumer, and I keep going back to the end consumer and that need for transparency in the supply chain. I have to look them in the eye and say, this has been ethically and sustainably harvested. So that's a really important part of what our brand needs to, the trust that's been established in this brand over a long time. But yes, I've always worked in the marketing and branding space previously to purchasing this company. I worked actually for the New Zealand government in a trade development role. And through that, I was really privileged to work with a number of companies who were exporting products out of New Zealand into lots of international markets. And the things that through my experience of working alongside them, I observed a number of key trends, which I believe play really well into the opportunity New Zealand has for seaweed. And that was obviously the rise in plant-based nutrition around the world, not only for its health benefits, but also the environmental kind of credentials of plant-based food. I think secondly, this growing realization that, and it's been further developed since COVID hit, that we need to eat better to keep our immunity high. And so eating better quality food and more nutrient dense food has also become important. The third, I've already alluded to this need for transparency in the supply chain. So actually understanding where your food comes from, understanding that you're going to be trusting that how it's been harvested is important, and that what we say it is actually what it is. We have lots of opportunity, I guess, and I'm sure Brendan will talk some more about this. The care and there is a Maori term called kaitiakitanga, which is really, it's a sense of guardianship and the sense of doing things well today that protects for the future generations. And these are concepts that are well established in New Zealand, and I think are going to be really important as this industry develops for us. And then fourthly, as Nigel's already alluded to, where we're located, we have some natural advantages because of our beautiful ocean, clean oceans. The isolation means that we have less pollution and a lot of coastline. So these factors all together just kind of built an opportunity in my mind for taking this little business and sort of, I guess, the original vision of the business was to teach New Zealanders how to eat seaweed, and our vision has always been from the outset to take New Zealand seaweeds to the world. And I think as we go on this journey together, the things that I keep coming back to is really, and it is something that we have to be mindful of here in New Zealand because of our geographic isolation, is being very mindful of that end consumer. And not becoming too sort of parochial about, what we can make or what we can do here, but actually what is the demand in overseas markets. And that's something that sort of hits us every day. It's about growing an entire value chain. It's about how we collaborate and work collectively. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity, but also some things that we need to watch out for as we emerge into a more international space.
We will touch base on this in the next questions. But so the environment looks very, very important, and New Zealand is recognized, for its strict environmental policy. I know that in New Zealand there's more 1,000 wild species of seaweed, and some have been imported, so they are considered as a pest, and we're talking about undaya. So I would say that how, the strict regulation for the environmentals, how this could affect or accelerate, the development of sustainable seaweed industry. And I will turn to Nigel because your company, Envirostrat, has a wide lens on this developing of seaweed. And can you tell us how important and how do you think, the certification is for the market, and what can we elaborate, in terms of new development and new regulation for making sure that the environment, concern is not becoming just a burden?
It's a big question, isn't it? So I guess the starting point here, as I mentioned earlier, and Hayley said, is we already have we have clean water, which is a help. We have a lot of water pollution problems coming off the land, which puts additional sediment and nutrients in the water. But further offshore, it's generally very clean. So that's a good start. We have a stable government, and we have consistent environmental policy and regulation. So all of those are helpful. We also have the government today is very, very interested in promoting the growth of the sector, but promoting it in the right kind of way. And so if we look at some of the challenges that we as a country will want to avoid, it will be the very large scale monoculture development that can impact biodiversity, that is simply seeking to maximize the volume of product that's being created without recognition perhaps of the need to protect what is already here and not displace the native flora and fauna. And Brendan will talk more about this soon. That's an area that he's doing a lot of work in. But one of the things we've just started recently in New Zealand that I think is really helpful is the development of a national framework for a sustainable seaweed sector. So that's funded through an organisation called Sustainable Seas, which provides research funding for ocean-based research science and the blue economy. And so this work that we're just starting now is intending to look at where we are today as an emerging sector, and then what the building blocks are going to be for the future to enable the country to have a high value, low negative impact sector that allows for the four well-beings, the cultural values, the social values, the environmental values, and the economic value to be derived from the sector. So we've just recently begun that work with an research organisation called Cawthron and ourselves doing that. And I think the intention of that over the next 12 to 18 months is to enable the sector as it continues to grow, whether it be regulatory or investment or moving into new markets, any of these new areas, but having a really strong, consistent framework in place will allow the industry to grow in the right directions. And also, we intend that it will also help us prevent it growing in the wrong directions towards those areas where New Zealand shouldn't try and compete. And we need to use our natural advantages, and we need to really clearly avoid trying to compete in those markets where we can't compete on either price or volume or proximity to market.
Very interesting. And so using seaweed for environmental restoration, maybe I will turn to Brendan, because you have a different lens, to the discussion today. And can you tell us about the environmental, project you're running in the South Island?
Sure. Yes, certainly. The project that we're running is based on the word that Hayley used, kotiakitanga. So there are a number of customary fisheries managers within our tribe, Ngāi Tahu. Now, Ngāi Tahu, our tribal area extends most of the South Island of New Zealand, and we have a network of these customary protected areas. And the customary managers are charged with sustaining those areas and ensuring that there's a healthy and abundant fishery for all. And so around 30 years ago, that invasive seaweed that you spoke about, Undaria, turned up on our shores. And initially we didn't really, we thought that there was obviously a threat there with any introduced species. Over the years, this particular seaweed has, I guess, infested our shores to the detriment of our native seaweeds. So 5 years ago, Ngāi Tahu managed to get a permit through Biosecurity New Zealand to harvest of natural substrates, this invasive seaweed. That permit has now been extended from just a handful of customary protected areas to include most of Ngāi Tahu's customary protection areas. So it's a large volume of particularly the eastern coastline of New Zealand. But our work is around controlling this what we consider a pest in New Zealand, which is a valuable commodity in other parts of the world, as we've discovered. We're in the process now of training up Tahu divers to get into the water and hand harvest this from our pristine waters, with the idea that potentially the selling of this invasive seaweed can sustain the control program. We're told that to eradicate it would be almost impossible, but we hope to control it enough in these special customary protected areas that it won't spread and impact on our native seaweeds. So yeah, these 25 divers, if you like, that this is this year's intake. We hope to increase that over the next few years to get our people back into the water, get them back into an industry that's probably not quite as it's flourishing at the moment, whereas our fisheries, our inshore fisheries, that once sustained a lot of the families in these small communities, that is gone. With the quota management system in this country, the big companies have taken the lion's share of the fishing, and it's left small coastal communities like our one almost being divorced from making a living out of the ocean. So we're hoping that with a bit of korero, with a bit of talk with Nigel and Hayley and others in the industry in New Zealand, we may be able to address some of these supply issues with the area. There's a huge amount of it out there. It's expensive to extract because it's not farmed. So this is wild harvest and much more an control program rather than anything commercial. The commercial side of it is a really nice to have, what do they call it, second bottom line or third bottom line. So that's where Ngāi Tahu is situated, and particularly in this industry around, or this potential industry around the area.
Thank you, Brendan. Just coming back to the potential development from the seaweed and the real high-value product that we can develop, maybe, Hayley, you can give us a perspective on what could be the potential if we get into human nutrition, cosmetic, pharmaceutical. You think that based on what we just heard, there is a market and there is a need maybe to accelerate and to go up in the value chain? And what will be the mandatory step that, you as a collective organization, government, civil society, industry, what do you need to do?
Yeah, I mean, lots of questions in that. What Brendan's just been talking about, and Daria or Wakami, the irony is that I actually can't get enough of it. I can't fulfill the demand that I have from Japanese companies looking down this part of the world for clean. It is a pest. We definitely have market for it, but the frustration is it's not sort of moving fast enough for the demand. So it's always a catch-22 as a more entrepreneurial company. We have to be confident there's a supply there before we go and build the market. But we can't build a market until we are confident there's supply. So it's a little bit of a balancing act constantly. And I think the second part of your question was really around the high value aspects of it. And for us, as Nigel said, we can't do, and Brendan's also alluded to it, we can't do mass market food. I'm not qualified to talk about the cosmetics or nutraceutical applications because we just really focus on the food aspects, but food is foundational. It's something that New Zealand does really well, and we definitely need to be playing the food space with respect to seaweed, particularly seaweeds that grow beautifully here and are a pest. you know, we have the opportunity to sort of build that market. So I think I'm just coming back to some of your questions. Sorry, Pierre, I've got distracted. You were talking about the.
No, I was talking about, you know, the real opportunities and what we need to do, you know, to,
Yeah.
well, as
I think it needs to move faster. We need to move faster. We are leaving a lot of opportunities on the table, and we are not responding to the demand fast enough. And I'm very excited about some of the work that Nigel's doing, because having that strategic agenda more about what we're not going to do as a country and what are we going to do collectively, that is where the power is, because we are a small nation. So for us to all align behind the same strategic insight is really where the power is. And then I think with a more strategic approach, our regulatory framework needs updating to reflect what our strategy is. So we don't tie ourselves up in red tape, but also so that we put in place the appropriate measures to protect. And again, I often say it's the quota management system counts how much seaweed is harvested. I'm more interested in how it's being harvested. Has it been harvested sustainably? So the regulation, we do have some regulation there. It's outdated, but it's also not fit for purpose. And as we grow, I think there's a real opportunity to make sure that the regulatory framework helps us, doesn't hinder us, in the short term and the long term. Because if the brand New Zealand isn't associated with doing it the right way, we not only do we destroy the environment, but we also destroy the economic opportunity further down the track.
So this is an important point. And as a nation, you are an innovative nation in terms of social economic aspects. So most of the time, you know, the farmers in the past, they have been, you know, the adjustment variable in the agriculture economic equation. How could we make sure that with this seaweed industry, the seaweed farmer won't be this variable adjustment? And Nigel, you have a collective project bringing many of the New Zealanders together with support from the US with a project called Green Wave. Maybe you can elaborate and tell us more about this?
Sure. So Green Wave was established in the northeast of the US just over 10 years ago. Much like what Brendan was talking about before, where you've got these fishing communities that can't catch fish anymore. The fish stocks are gone. Green Wave was established in the same sorts of small coastal fishing communities. It's regenerative ocean farming, so it grows, the Green Wave farmers always grow seaweed, but they grow some other species as appropriate to different areas. So Green Wave, I went over to the States just over 2 years ago to meet them and seek permission to bring the concept to New Zealand and adapt it to our context, to our bicultural context, to the aquaculture context, etc. So we're just now starting the piloting of seaweed farming. As we've been looking at what do we need to do to bring Green Wave here, one of the main things that they've, in the US and here, they've stayed very true to is that the farmer has to be enabled to be successful. And that means the farmer must be commercially viable. And what happens throughout the primary sector, certainly in this country and much of the world, is that you have consolidation and you have the larger corporate dominance of either parts of the supply chain or the consolidation of lots of small farms into larger farms. And so what we're starting here in New Zealand in 4 locations is recognizing that no one's farmed seaweed yet. And going to Hayley's point, that's the frustration that she has. She has demand here, supply is down here. She has to import the product. We know we need to be able to farm it. But in order to do that and to maintain that farmer first, enable the farmer to succeed, we're creating what will become a farmer-owned cooperative. It won't be called Greenwave, but it will be. It'll be a New Zealand name, but it's following a lot of those philosophies that Greenwave has so successfully developed. The kelp farmer has the kelp farmer's rights at the centre. We need to make sure that the farmer can access product from a hatchery at a fair price. We need to make sure that whatever those farmers are growing is able to be sold at a fair price so that the farmer can be a viable business. So this is not simply seeking to create jobs, it's seeking to create businesses that have jobs, but also to bring the additional social benefit that you will get from having small business owners that succeed. So we're working with a number of organisations, research organisations, some government funding and some impact investment funding. And we will be starting that pilot soon. The intention is we're starting with Aclonia, the brown seaweed that Agrasea uses, and we're partnering with Agrasea because there is an existing pathway to market. Hayley, we'd like to be able to sell some seaweed to you as well. But
bring it on.
Over the next 12 to 18 months, the intention is that we will fully test the supply chain from end to end. We will embed those philosophies and the practices that will always ensure that the farmer is enabled. The supply chain then, we think, will be able to expand rapidly because it will have the right reasons underpinning it. And we will have training so we can support the development of a new workforce. New Zealand already is very, very good at mussels and oysters. So we know how to farm in the ocean, but we've never done it with seaweed. So we think there's some adaptation with the bicultural context and working with tribes is incredibly important to this work as well. So we're really excited. We're going to have our first lines in the water in about a month and build our first hatchery starting in about September with the intention being late summer in New Zealand. So March, April, we will put hatchery grown product into the water and get moving on that.
Excellent. And let me come back, to Brandon because he's representing, one of the most important tribes in the South. So how do you see the role of the farmers? And would you say that there is a way to build a new social economic model using the seaweed industry as a key catalyst or a key accelerator?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions around seaweed and farming because we are concentrating on this invasive seaweed. We're not particularly excited about having undaria farms, for instance, continuing to reseed what's considered a pest. And the other conversation is particularly with Ngāi Tahu, because of the settlement, we have a lot of taonga species, so species of seaweed that were identified as taonga as treasures, and they have a certain protection under law in terms of whether they can be harvested or not. So those conversations are, at a higher level than where I sit, but the understandings of having to protect our native seaweeds, very important, and there's the opportunity around farming those ones, I think, is a really exciting one for iwi throughout the country, and for industry obviously as well. So those conversations, as I say, are in their infancy in many cases, particularly because the industry, the commercial industry is kind of new, particularly to the South Island. So, and I understand that a lot of good work is going on in the North Island of Aotearoa, New Zealand, but in the South here, we're very much early players in this particular field. We have very little aquaculture in Otago as well, simply because of the coastline. Whereas Southland and Marlborough certainly have a lot more aquaculture than what's happening, and locally here.
Excellent. So we have almost 10 minutes, and I'd like you to respond quickly to the next question, because I'd like also to spend some time on the key takeaway message with you guys. First question, we mentioned the role of the government, and New Zealand is a small country, but great in spirit and great in terms of innovation. What would be, the one or two recommendation you do, to the politics, listening to you maybe this morning? What do you ask, and what could be of seaweed sustainable industry development? Nigel, you go first.
Okay, so I think there are 4 areas for government. One is the government holds an incredible amount of data and information, and so being able to access that is important. A second role, obviously, the regulatory and the policy settings that the government has. In our case, it's at a national and a regional level, and so getting the policy and the regulatory settings in place to enable the growth of the sector in the right ways. And we're not there yet because we don't have a sector. So what we have has been is out of date. The third area is that the government is an incredibly important catalyst. It can help move things along through research, through R&D, investment in technology, innovation, so that there is an incredibly important role there for the government. And the fourth area aligned with that is the government as an investor. And so we have a lot of different government agencies that provide both grant funding and either debt or equity funding for these sorts of innovative and high value initiatives. And that's an incredibly important area of government. It doesn't mean, I believe, that government should be paying for everything, but the role that government has effectively can allow it to take that first risk to make the future investors slightly less risky because of the role of government, either alongside other investors or in those early pilots in the farming, so that the future means we have greater certainty and clarity about what we can achieve.
Brendan, you'll be next, for the government. I just want to add, in the context of your answer, the international relationship, because we heard the minister from Tearii, you as the Pacific nations should get together and try, to organize something more coherent in terms of marine resources coordination. So what would be the one or two points that you'd like, to address and ask, the government, to be more efficient on?
Yeah, well, I'd really like to put in a plug for the restoration of some of our disappearing native kelp forests, particularly in the south here. We have large forests of Macrocystis, that's the giant kelp, the bladder kelp, that have disappeared from our region. And it's the research that we're shows so far that sedimentation, those land-based activities have potentially destroyed these kelp forests in the south. I think, some work around cleaning up our land and stopping that sediment getting into these, as we say, pristine areas, I think is really important. That's the government's role there, to understand the interface between the land and the marine environment.
And Ellie, from an industry point of view, what are your expectations in terms of fostering the development of the seaweed industry? What do you expect from the international counterparts? What are you looking for? And finally, my next question will be, and I don't think we'll have much time on this, but is there an important potential using blue bonds to attract more investment in the seaweed industry? Ellie.
I reiterate both what Nigel and Brendan have said. I would full-heartedly agree with. I think from our perspective, seaweed seems to just fall through the cracks a little bit. It's managed at the moment under fisheries, and so even the speak around harvest is actually it's about the catch. It's not about the harvest. So I hope that we will have an increased focus on seaweed specifically, and not just seaweed, but actually at a species level, because there is such, each one is so unique and so potentially special in a number of different ways. And if we can't use a big blunt instrument to develop this sector. We have to be really, the devil is a little bit in the detail. As well as having a big picture, we need to go into the detail to understand where the priorities are and to actually make sure that we're addressing it at a species level. But also the other thing I think for me that is a big, is the pace of change is too slow. And many people have been in this industry longer than I, and they say that recently it has sped up. But I still think, given where the world is going and the opportunity that New Zealand has, we're moving too slowly. And I'm hopeful from the work that our colleagues here on the panel are doing in different areas that this comes together and really gives the government confidence to invest behind this sector, because there is so much potential for New Zealand to do this well, and potentially to even be a global. We haven't got any industry really yet, so we can design it for the future. This is a huge opportunity compared to many other countries where it's more established and bad habits are set in.
But if you look at your next door neighbor, Australia, and we're going to spend some time. We have 2 sessions. The next 2 sessions are based in Australia. The South Australia government has been, investing a lot and bringing all the key stakeholders together, to build this seaweed industry. Is there not a possibility maybe to collaborate and to see what you can get, from them, and how you can implement, their views in this new seaweed industry? Because they have the same vision, and they have also a strong indigenous, population, Aboriginal population that counts, for the seaweed industry. So the model is very similar. And why don't you increase collaboration with Australia at that point? Maybe Nigel?
I agree with that. One other thing I did want to add, Pierre, just on the and where Hayley used to work. So New Zealand Trade and Enterprise exists. Its job is to market New Zealand goods and services and products to the world, and so it's a role that where you were asking before about the international side of it. They also, part of their role is to seek the inbound investment from foreign countries that is looking to invest in New Zealand. And so there's a really important role from an international perspective for the NZTE to both help us access those markets and also for the inbound investment. On the collaboration, I think it's an incredibly important point. And one of the areas we in New Zealand, despite the fact that we are the government is investing into R&D and we've got this framework being developed, there's still a lot we can learn from other countries. We will never have the same amount of money or the same number of people and the researchers. So it's always hard for us, and that's where I think the collaboration is incredibly important. That seaweed framework that I mentioned before, part of that will be we've been speaking with the equivalent in Australia, and they're 9 months ahead of us, and they released their equivalent document late last year. But that's a really valuable starting point for us to see how they went about developing it, things like collaboration both within the country and then with other countries. I think these frameworks, they're the sorts of things that we want to make sure we're really emphasizing. That way we can, our isolation in the world becomes much less of a disadvantage. And I think we do that well in other parts of the primary sector and generally with New Zealand.
I think it might be too late, for you, but the last session that will take us, to Alaska and British Columbia will bring a similar perspective on their isolation and the need, to collaborate more with the rest of the world. And I think that you are the far end of the world, if we compare with Alaska, but the similarities are tremendously, important, and I think that we should think about developing these synergies between countries that have seaweed in common as a key vector for economic development. So I think that we have 5 minutes. So in 1 minute, each of you, I would like you to express one takeaway message for our audience. And in order to build up, the momentum during the next sessions, what will be the message you want to convey to the audience, and what you want to say? Brandon, you go first.
Yeah, well, thank you, Pierre. I guess I would come back to the kaitiakitanga. That is the stewardship that we have, and the opportunity that this industry might give our people to once again be engaged in an industry around the ocean, and people that are invested in the ocean have, I think, have a much more to gain or to lose by the decisions that are made there. And our people, as tangata tiaki, as kaitiaki, would really welcome the opportunity to once again be involved in a less extractive industry than the fishing, perhaps. The sea vegetables and that healthy diet and all that thing, I think, could really help the Māori people of Aotearoa. Kia ora.
Nigel, what is your takeaway message? I think that you describe, the history of the seaweed industry in New Zealand.
Yeah.
What will be the future, and what will be the most important, focus that we need, to have, if we want to grow really this industry?
Small is beautiful. I think we are a small place at the far end of the world. We cannot and should not compete with large volume markets that are closer to their end markets. And so therefore we need to develop the niche products. Agrasea's got hydrogel products, which are incredible for wound care. The stuff that Hayley's doing, the work that CH4 Global and Sea Forest are doing with Asparagopsis, which has incredible potential for methane reduction. These are the sorts of niche areas, and there's others that we must focus on, and doing it in a way that then allows us to compete with the world.
Excellent. Ellie?
So I keep coming back to the end consumer, and what the three things that I find myself repeating over and again to try and educate people about why they should eat seaweed are just its incredible nutritional value, which is there's no land plant that comes anywhere close to what seaweeds offer for food. The second is the environmental credentials. I often find myself covered in goosebumps talking about that. I'm so fortunate to work on a product. I've never worked on a product that is so good for the world, and that gives us we can't take the credit. Nature's making the products. We just pack it into a food safe way and try and understand what customers are looking for in terms of the format to make it easy to eat. But the third thing that is increasingly surprising to me is that each one is so unique. Each seaweed has different flavor, different taste, different texture, different nutrients. And so this, I believe the need to look at the detail to make sure we get that right is part of how we build something that's sustainable.
Thank you so much for this very important message. Brandon, I would like to ask you something important, for me. Usually, each time you start a meeting, a ceremony, you say something in your native language. Maybe you can do the conclusion and pass the relay, to our friends to Australia. And why don't you say that in Maori?
Okay. Well, kia ora, Pierre. Yeah, I will. Look, I'll do a karakia that has been handed down from our earliest arrivals in the South Island of New Zealand and pass the baton on to our colleagues in Australia. Haia te awa o puti toa puti waho o te pakiako o te rākau, o maire nuku, o maire raki o maire o te marapenoa. I roka tāne, i rāro tāne, te raki ihi a tāne, o pakpako a tāne, noho ka no te ariki, wātu e tāne kiuka, o tūturu o whiti whakamaua ki a tīna, omi e hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora.
Thank you so much for this very interesting opening session. We're going to now move, to Australia. And I just want, to thank all our supporters, sponsors, for making this event free for all our attendees. This is a first initiative that goes around the clock. I hope that next year we're going to spend more time in New Zealand. And we're already talking about a Seaweed Week around the clock, because everybody would like, to what they have accomplished, in between. And I look forward, to meeting with you again and prepare the ground, for the next year event. Thank you so much, Brandon, Nigel, Hayley. Thanks for your passionate involvement, and keep up the good job. And maybe you'll join us, with the next session in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pierre.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.